Thank you. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Tyler Jones. During the day, you can find me doing iOS engineering related stuff at Meetup. And then on nights and weekends, I kind of tinker around on IP cams. As much as I'd love to tell you about all the fun stuff we're doing at Meetup, this talk was really born out of IP cams. Now, what is IP cams, you might ask? IP cams is kind of like a side passion project of mine, and it is for viewing home IP security cameras. Now, it's really a niche of a niche. I don't expect any of you to really heard of it before, but usually when you think of security cameras, you might think of like Nest or Ring. This is really for more obscure stuff and not so obscure stuff like Amcrest or Foscam, or a lot of cheap ones that don't even really have a brand name. Usually for those apps, you find out that the first-party app is not great, or there is no app at all. So this was really to try to fill that gap, and it was really something I needed at the time for the cameras I was using. Now, this project started back in 2015 and largely stayed the same up to about this time last year. Now, if you look at it, it's not super inspiring, just a standard UIKit app, runs on the iPhone, not anything special. But through this past year, I took it from that to this, which is basically, this talk is a culmination of my journey from taking it from iPhone to supporting iOS, iPadOS, macOS, tvOS, and watchOS. Now, the talk I titled was From the Mac to the TV, the iPhone to the Watch, your app everywhere. And it's really about building native multi-platform apps for Apple platforms from a singular code base, which was super verbose. So I tried to cut it down, and that wasn't even enough. But really, the talk is, taking a singular code base and supporting all of Apple's platforms. And there's three main topics I want to talk about. The first is Apple Platforms UI. Apple Platforms, kind of go over from start to finish to see where we are today, which leads us into the more technical aspects of it, what it takes to take a iOS app, import it to other platforms. And then finally, the whys and why nots, kind of the business use cases of why it worked for me and why or why not it might work for you. So without further ado, let's get started. Apple's platforms have been around for a long time. This is really just, let's take a step back and go back to the year 2001. 2001 might seem like yesterday, and honestly, it's about 20 years ago, believe it or not. 2001 was a big year because that was the year that Mac OS X was introduced to the public. It was a brand new OS for Mac, and it was going to be Unix-like. So this was a departure from classic Mac OS to bring more stability to the platform. But most importantly to us, it brought a new UI to it, so new fancy Aqua UI, and brought what was collectively known as the Cocoa APIs out to the public, which for us was AppKit and Foundation. Now, there were other APIs at the time that you could use for Carbon, but AppKit was really, I guess you can say, the foundation of what modern Apple APIs we use for making iOS apps. Now, if I stood up here and said this all started in 2001, I'd be wrong. A lot of this can actually be traced back to Next, back from the late 80s. Next was, I guess, a Steve Jobs, that was his new startup after he left Apple in the 80s, which brought the Next computers and the next step for the OS. So a lot of the underpinnings we had for Mac OS X really came from Next Step. So it was Next new OS, Unix-like, didn't have a fancy Aqua UI, but we had the beginnings of AppKit and Foundation and tools like Interface Builder. So let's fast forward a few years. 2007. Arguably an important year for probably all of us in this room. First and foremost, iPhone was introduced to the public. I know we didn't get necessarily the SDK in 2007, but it was a game changer. I think Android followed soon after in 2008. And iOS, as we all know, new OS derived from Mac OS. But instead of Cocoa frameworks, we have Cocoa Touch. So kind of a reimagining of what was there for the Mac, but for the iPhone. And instead of AppKit, we got UIKit. Kind of, I guess, a modern reimagining of AppKit for more touch-friendly interfaces, but underneath, we still have that same shared foundation. Now, 2010 came along, and the iPad was introduced. You might have been like me at the time, and it was like, oh, it's just a blown-up iPhone. Why would anyone want that? And I was absolutely wrong about that. But really, the iPad ran iOS, and it's all the same frameworks underneath. Now, fast forward 5 more years to 2015. 2015 was arguably an important year for Apple's platforms because 2 platforms were introduced to us as developers. First and foremost was watchOS. watchOS, in my opinion, kind of had a rough start. I tried to get on with it early on. It was a very iOS-dependent one where it was weird, where the logic, the app extension ran on your phone and communicated over Bluetooth to the watch. But over the years, it has evolved into a fully derived and independent OS where it can run apps on its own. Started out with WatchKit as its UI framework, which was heavily reliant on storyboards, but at the same time has a shared foundation, which you can kind of see a theme coming together here. Late 2015 was the introduction of tvOS. Now, the Apple TV had been around for multiple years before this, but the Apple TV Gen 4, which came out in 2015, brought tvOS, which was finally the ability for regular developers like you or me to create apps for the Apple TV. It was a new OS derived from iOS, but designed for the 10-foot experience. So instead of using a touchscreen to interact with it, you're using a remote. Thankfully, it used UIKit as a UI framework for it, and also the shared foundation. So it was a relatively easy lift if you wanted to take an iOS app and work on a tvOS app. Now let's pause here for a second. If we look at where we were after the introduction of each platform, we have four different platforms, or 5 if you consider the iPad separate, with 3 different UI frameworks. We've got AppKit, UIKit, and WatchKit. Now, if you were like me at the time, I had looked at trying to build a Mac app, trying to build a watch app at different times, but I had tried and failed. Those different UI frameworks were just enough friction for me to be like, I'm not a Mac developer, I'll just stick with iOS. So what changed since then? Well, 2019 was arguably an important year because 2 important technologies came out. First and foremost was Mac Catalyst. Mac Catalyst was the way for you to run a UIKit app on the Mac. So all of the UIKit APIs you know and love now work on the Mac. It was famously introduced as just a checkbox. I would like to say it starts with a checkbox. You've got a little bit more work behind it, but it made it really easy to get started for creating a Mac app from an existing UIKit code base. Now, even though it made it easy to get started, there were still some platform considerations you have to take into account. If you're using hardware specific to the iPhone, like ARKit or a gyro or something, it wouldn't necessarily work on the Mac. And also architecture differences. So if you were using any libraries that required, ARM-based architecture versus Intel on the Mac, you had a little bit of issue there. 2019, probably the more important and definitely the more newsworthy one, was the introduction of SwiftUI. Now, SwiftUI was introduced as a modern declarative reactive UI, and a very big departure from existing UI frameworks. If you look at it, AppKit, the origins of AppKit have been around since the late 80s. That's over 30 years of, polish and stability on it. And then we've got SwiftUI coming in and being like, we're going to throw that all the way. But the good thing about it is it created a unified UI API for all platforms. So if you know how to write SwiftUI code, it makes it very easy to write it for any of Apple's platforms. If you know what a toggle is, you can create a toggle on all platforms, irregardless of what the underlying implementation is, because it maps to existing UIs. It might be a switch on iOS, might be a checkbox on macOS, it might be the weird toggle thing on tvOS, but it makes it relatively easy. But at the same time, it's easy to look at SwiftUI as just where you're going to create one singular code base for all platforms and write it once, run it anywhere, kind of like the old Java adage. And really, it's a learn once, apply anywhere type thing. So if you know how to write SwiftUI, it makes it relatively easy to support other platforms. Where the magic really comes for me is, now that we're starting to share code, UI code, we can start creating shared components. You don't necessarily want the same app across all platforms, but you can start creating, custom buttons or custom lists that finally bridges the gap from separate frameworks to one framework across all systems. Now, 2020, Apple introduced Apple Silicon. So famously, the M1 Macs were introduced. And what that is basically, because Macs are finally using the same processors that are in your iPhone, you can run iOS apps directly on Mac unmodified. It's the same app, same UI, which comes with its own give or take depending on how well an iOS UI works on the Mac. And like I said with the Mac Catalyst stuff, is you do have to take some platform considerations into account if you're using any hardware that doesn't exist on the Mac. But we're finally at the step that there's no architectural differences. So if you're using any type of ARM-based libraries, it works on the Mac just fine. So that brings us to today, building multi-platform apps. We have all the same languages. It's the Swift and Objective-C, however you want to write it. The same tooling. So if you're familiar with Xcode, you love it or you hate it, it's there and it makes it easy. And finally, we're getting to the point that we can share the same code base. So for me, for my app, finally one code base can support 5 platforms through, I guess, what you consider a shared foundation. So whether you're using Apple's foundational APIs or you're creating your own shared framework, you can share that business logic across the board. There's lots of similarities now that we have same UI frameworks. But depending on how you approached it and where I approached it from the past, you had anyone from 1 to 4 different UIs. And that really was a holdup for me. which kind of gets me into my journey with IP cams over this past year. So let's talk a little bit about the technical part. So when I first started saying, hey, I want to port my app to multiple platforms, the first thing was figuring out how was I going to share the so-called business logic. And there's multiple ways to do it. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And it's figuring out how to modularize that code. I do a lot of selective targeting. So basically saying, hey, I've got these shared files and I want to put them on the Mac app, the TVO app, but maybe not the Watch app. I do a little bit of it. I do have an internal shared framework that I use a little bit. But if you wanted to take it to the next level, you could do more separate internal frameworks or even external packages via Swift Package Manager or CocoaPods. And also, when that doesn't work, using availability checks. So if you need a separate implementation for something that works on Watch versus TV versus the Mac or iPhone, you can easily do that with macros or Swift availability attributes. So now that I had this shared foundation, it was great because I use a core data with CloudKit Sync. So the first thing I was able to do when I started supporting other platforms is drop it in and I'd have data right away. I wouldn't have to worry about building a UI out for adding data. I could just get started on the fun stuff. So what happens when we start looking at the iPhone or the iPad? It's just a big iPhone, right? In a way, if you're not already supporting the iPad targeting, I would say go ahead and support it. I kind of supported it before, but it wasn't great. The great thing about it too is if you don't already support it and you want to support it, you can add it with just your debug builds. So if you want to try it out and do development on it, over some time, you can just keep it internal. And then from there, I kind of just started adding feature by feature to make the iPad app into an iPad app that really stands on its own. So the first thing I did was, I think this came out in iOS 14, was adding the sidebar. So this is kind of like this was a UI paradigm that was taken from the Mac, but kind of replace the tab bar and have some nice app shortcuts. Then I started looking at my content. One of the first things I did as I kind of went from start to finish is some of these margins are way too big on the iPad. They're too hard to read. So you can use what's considered the readable content guide. Very simply, if you're using a standard table view, you can use the cell layout margins follow readable width property, and that just brings the margins into something that's more readable. And then for anything that uses custom constraints on a table view or collection view, you can use the content layout guide and pin your constraints to that. Then I added mouse and keyboard support. Mouse support, I think, came in iOS 13 to the iPad. Keyboard had been around, but adding keyboard shortcuts and custom hover modifiers. I added support for multiple windows, which I did not have before, so someone could run multiple instances side by side or switch back and forth between one or the other. And this is not something I've done, but it's something you could consider if you want to, in adding proper support for more split views. The sidebar is technically a split view, but if you wanted to do something like a tri-column like Mail has, where you have the sidebar, a list of mail, and then the detail view on the side, you can do that as well. So once I kind of decided, I wanted to improve the iPad app, started looking at the Mac, teaching an old dog new tricks. The great thing, depending on how you approach it, is if you're building for the Mac today, a lot of those modern iPad features translate well to the Mac or vice versa, whether you went Mac first to iPad or iPad to Mac. All the mouse and keyboard support, the sidebar, the multiple windows all translate very well. But if you're getting started, you might be like me as well and be like, when Apple Silicon first came out, I actually disabled my app running on M1 Macs because I was like, I don't know how well it works. Once I got my hands on it, I'm like, this actually works pretty well. Yeah, the UI paradigms aren't great because you've got weird UI iOS stuff on the Mac, but I went ahead and enabled it as like a first step because that was able to help me figure out what worked and what didn't work. From there, I went ahead and actually started looking at Mac Catalyst. I checked the checkbox and started development on it. Now, since I already had some iPad stuff going, a lot of that stuff translated over, but then I was able to add other features such as a menu bar support for shortcuts and menu bar stuff, and then a proper toolbar. And that really helped bring the Mac app to where it is today, to being an actual proper Mac app versus just a iOS app on the Mac. Now, taking an iOS app and going to the iPad and Mac is relatively easy, but what about the other platforms that don't share, common code or common UIs? So the first was the Apple Watch. So really rethinking the app and what it would mean on your wrist. Ultimately, this is something that I didn't think would work very well for my app, but it actually worked okay. If I were starting today, and this is kind of the way I approached it, I would say embrace Swift UI. Swift UI on the watch is much more advanced than anything WatchKit ever provided me. And really what the watch is trying to figure out what those short interactions were. You're not going to want to hold your watch up to like this for, several minutes. So really focusing on what short burst of data you could provide. And then support for complications. So I don't really have any exact, stats, but complications are good for weather stuff or whether you're having a bank balance or any other stats. Mine is honestly just a dumb shortcut to the app right now, but it works relatively well if you need to get into it fast. And this is not something I support, but is also good if you want, is if you have any type of custom notification UI on the iPhone, you can also create a similar custom UI for the watch. Which just brings us to the Apple TV, building for the 10-foot experience per se. Now, the good thing about the Apple TV is it uses all of the same UI frameworks that you already use on iOS. It uses UIKit, uses SwiftUI, so it's a relatively easy lift to get started. But the big difference there is it's navigable by remote instead of using touch. So how you interact with the app definitely is much different. And because you use a remote, it is a departure in app structure. So some of the common UI themes you might have with the navigation bar and navigation controls don't necessarily exist on tvOS. So it's really rethinking how it works. But for me, it was figuring out what made sense. Obviously, for viewing a security camera feed, that's the most important thing, and it made sense because it was kind of like streaming content. But it's really about figuring out what those main shared experiences and content are that make sense on the big screen and make sense for the 10-foot experience. You can't, any tiny text, anything like that is not going to work any well. You want big focused targets. So really figuring out how that works with your app. Which gets me to the last point of the technical part. Creating shared UIs. Like I mentioned before, having 4 different UI frameworks was honestly too much friction for me. As a small indie developer working on my own app, I just never had the time. But now we're finally getting to the point that there are UI frameworks that work at least on 4 out of the 5 platforms, or 5 if you consider SwiftUI. So for me, I started out leveraging UIKit with Catalyst. I actually tried a short stint of doing SwiftUI and AppKit in the intermediate and realized that was just too much friction because I had already had a healthy UIKit code base. So the first was doing this for me. And then also embracing SwiftUI. I recognize SwiftUI can be a hot topic. Some people love it, some people hate it. I like it, and I have a healthy mix of both, but you can really go either way. And really, with creating shared UIs, it was finally getting to the point that I could create shared UI components. So instead of creating a full-on separate UI for the Mac, I could share stuff with the iOS app that made sense. That really helped. Which also got to the point that I could share view models and view logic, which wouldn't have worked before. But when creating this, you don't want to share everything. Some things make sense on the iPhone, don't make sense on the Mac. So really what helps is to think of focusing on those unique core experiences. So for my app, it was creating the camera viewer streaming screen, native and unique for each platform to make sure that's the best experience. But then for the stuff that matters but doesn't matter as much was sharing the rest. So for example, I heavily utilize SwiftUI forms for the add a camera screen, and that's shared across all 5 platforms. It's important because you need it to add a camera, but once it's there, most people don't look at it. So it's figuring out what's unique to the platform, what you can focus on, and then share the other stuff that matters but not as much. So that's some of the technical stuff. That kind of gets you into the whys and why nots, some of the business use cases. It's easy to stand up here and be like me and say, hey, do it just because it'd be fun. I recognize when I have the sole discretion of deciding what I want to do on my own app, it's easy to do that. But when it comes to business use cases of figuring out, does it make sense? Is there a return on investment? The answer is a developer's favorite phrase. Well, really, it depends. So here is kind of some general things that why it worked for me and why or why not it might work for you. First of all, is customer requests. I had multiple customer requests for honestly developing for all platforms. Some of the ones made sense, like for developing for the Mac and the TV. Developing for the watch, although personally I never thought it was going to be great, I did have customer requests for that really helped me at least decide to go down that route. Sometimes it's hard to figure out whether it's just a squeaky wheel or it's legit interest, but that was at least what prodded me thinking that direction. The good thing about I guess it's both a good and a bad thing, but when you consider Apple's other platforms, such as the App Store on the TV or the App Store on the Mac, there's a lot less competition. There's a lot less apps out there, which also lends you in your own right to be able to create something that stands out that might not stand out on a relatively mature app store like the iPhone, where it's just saturated with apps. For example, with my app being targeting such a niche market, I would have never dreamt I would have ever been ranked in any charts. But on the Mac App Store, depending on the country, I've been in the top 100, top 200 in utilities on the Mac, which is super cool for an app that has no marketing, which also can lead to more profit. Now, my app, I added in kind of a pro subscription option over the past year. And granted, it is small scale, so I can't really say how it would scale up. But for me, about 50% of my revenue for the past couple of months has come from non-iPhone platforms. So for me, ignoring the Mac and ignoring the TV would not put me out where I am today. So for that, I'm greatly surprised, and I'm grateful that I went down that route. But at the same time, you kind of have to think of what's the time resource constraint balance, figuring out that ROI. Classically, Instagram hasn't had an iPad app for the longest time. I don't even think they still have one today. They're a rich company. That doesn't hurt them at all. So figuring out how much time you can spend on porting to other platforms to minimize the time and resources to create the product. So let's look at each platform and see why or why not it might make sense. So for the iPad, if you already have an iPhone app, it's pretty easy to support with modern layouts. If you're using modern auto layout and you're not already supporting the iPad, it's pretty easy to do. If you're not supporting the iPad, customers will ask you and complain. Because what happens is when you have an iPhone app but not on the iPad, it just shows up I think it's a blown up iPhone SE or whatever sized interface, and it's not great. And because of that, unmodified apps running on the iPad aren't good. So being able to kind of take the next step and create an iPad experience is definitely a plus. But I also acknowledge at the same time, if your app has iPhone-specific applications that uses iPhone hardware that the iPad doesn't have, it might not make sense. So coming from the iPhone to the iPad definitely is an easy sell, minimal work to get started. What about the Mac? Well, if you're already thinking about the iPad, it's relatively easy to create a Mac app from a modern iPad code base, whether you're using Catalyst or whether you're using SwiftUI. What's great about the Mac is it's great for data entry or fine-grained control. So anything you have to do a lot of typing or fine-grained, motion control with the mouse makes it a lot easier. But one thing you have to consider as well is it could cannibalize other web apps or, cross-platform apps that your business might have. I don't have that. I was just an iOS app, so it made sense for me, but that would be something you might want to consider if you're creating that. But on the same vein, if you're worried about cannibalizing a web app, figure out how you could leverage your iOS app with native APIs such as push notification or Siri extension or whatever to really make it stand out and be useful on the Mac. But one disclaimer on the Mac as well is there are back support limits. Classically, a lot of people have ran into this, for example, 1Password, trying to figure out how far back you want to support. A lot of the newer technologies I mentioned today, like Mac Catalyst or SwiftUI, aren't going to back support to anything past Big Sur or Catalina, which comes with its own positives and negatives. For me, who doesn't have an app, I'm okay with just starting now and then extending that going further. But if you're really worried about that, then this process might not work for you. So now here we are supporting the iPad and the Mac. That's relatively easy, a relatively easy lift. How do you quantify the business use case for something like the Apple Watch? Honestly, it's hard. I didn't necessarily believe it. And really, generally as a whole, it's hard to quantify a lot of this until you actually get an app out there or you have a direct competitor you can compare to. So for me, it's figuring out what type of short interactions that worked out well for the watch. For my app, it's just a quick glance at a camera stream. For other stuff, it's more, there are things you could do. If you're in the health and fitness space, the Apple Watch makes a lot of sense. Chances are you're probably already there if you're in that space. Well, it's also good if you have any, your app surfaces up any stats that people care about checking a lot. So surface that up with a complication so it's right on the watch face for someone. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, anything that uses rich text notifications. So if you have a custom notification UI, and you want to do custom notification targeting the Apple Watch, that's a great fit as well. But this is kind of the opposite of the first bullet point of short interactions. Anything that requires data entry on the watch sucks. If you've ever tried to use a little scribble keyboard, it's not fun. Coincidentally, one of the routes I went with this app was creating a fully independent experience with watchOS 7. So technically, I support some of the stuff like signing up for in-app purchases and adding data entry for the watch because I was able to share the UI via SwiftUI, but it's not great. So trying to figure out those balances, honestly, for me, it was worth it. But it is hard to quantify this. And arguably, it's even harder to quantify the Apple TV, which on some hand, you would almost consider the bastard stepchild of Apple platforms. It is probably the least used platform, but what it's great for is anything media/content consumption. So for my app, obviously viewing a camera screen made sense because it was kind of media related. It's also great for creating shared experiences in the living room. So anything you want to share with family members or friends on the big screen really works well here, along with long-form content like movies or podcasts or something like that, which is kind of the opposite of the Apple Watch. But like the Apple Watch, there's limited data input. You really have to consider how someone would interact with the app because navigating by the remote sucks. Trying to do any type of text entry with the remote sucks. So figuring out how that would work, it really comes down to like both the Apple Watch and the Apple TV of creating more of a slimmed down version of your app, which is kind of what I did, of figuring out those experiences that really work. So, in conclusion, for me or for you, if you're considering supporting other platforms, today is easier than ever to do so. We've got the introduction of Mac Catalyst, we've got the introduction of SwiftUI. You can leverage an existing iOS code base to really support all platforms, which is awesome. I use both, and it honestly works pretty well. If you're doing it and you do it like me, starting out figuring out how to get that modular code, figuring out how to get that shared business logic was really the first step that let me hit the ground running for each platform. And I'll throw a hot take up here, SwiftUI being the future. Really, SwiftUI is a future. I love it. It works really well for multiple platforms, but I also recognize not everyone does love it. And because of that, UIKit isn't going anywhere anytime soon, at least for multi-platform apps. It supports 4 out of 5 platforms. It's stable, mature, and I use a lot of it as well. If you're going down this path, there are a lot of low-touch solutions for macOS and iPadOS if you don't already have an app, which it makes it really relatively easy to get started. So for myself, it was kind of like, I went from like crawl, walk, run stage in terms of let's start small. Let's just, enable the support, see what it looks like. Then let's start adding some more native features and getting it to where it, matures into an actual full-fledged app on those systems. And it's a relatively easy way to expand app reach. Before my app wasn't on any of the platforms, for example, like the Mac App Store and TV App Store, there really wasn't much competition in my space, which really made my app stand out more than it did before. And at least for me, I profited off of it. Not much, nothing to write home about yet, but the promise there is good, and I'm excited to see where it goes. So to kind of close it out, I want to leave you all with a couple of thoughts. And thoughts that I wish someone would have told me several years ago so I got started sooner rather than waiting until 2020 and 2021. Perfect is the enemy of good. It's really easy to get started if you were like me and say, hey, I want to support a Mac app, and I want to use AppKit because it is the most mature, and it's going to make the most polished app. Unless you're building an app for other fellow Apple developers, chances are your users aren't going to be able to tell the difference between Catalyst, between AppKit, between SwiftUI. And honestly, for me, leveraging SwiftUI and leveraging UIKit, even though it might not make the most polished Mac app, honestly was pretty good. So figuring out where that balance point is and figuring out that, you can start small and iterate on it really goes a long way. And if you have any interest in making a cross-platform app, I would say just go ahead and do it. Like, I, for one, welcome more competition and more of a flourishing app store on the tvOS and macOS. And with the technologies available today, it's easier than ever. So, in conclusion, thanks. Any questions? Everyone tired? I'm feeling the tiredness.
I'm really working on how to go across a lot of platforms. What do you think Apple could do to make your job easier?
So the question was, what could Apple do to make my job easier to make an app for more platforms? Honestly, two things I would say. Figure out a more cohesive developer marketing strategy, because there's a lot of questions of, should you go AppKit? Should you go Catalyst? Should you go SwiftUI? And the attention drawn in 3 different places makes it very confusing to figure out what makes sense for you. And second of all, I think the community has really stepped up in this regard, but some more documentation examples to figure out like more of the obscure stuff for doing Catalyst apps would be great. So figuring out, showing people that you can really do it from like an official standpoint would be good as well.
Yeah, what was the difficult part about adapting Catalyst, your iOS app?
So the question is, what was the most difficult part adapting my app for Catalyst? Probably the hardest roadblock is one that no one would ever run into, which was actually considering architectural differences, because I was using some like VLC kit libraries to do streaming, and their stuff does not work in Catalyst at all because Apple doesn't allow OpenGL ES, I think, via Catalyst app. So like that was something I had to consider. But on top of that as well was really figuring out, what UI paradigms to create in a Catalyst app. Because obviously when you're creating like an AppKit app, things come out of the box. It's looking like a Mac app. That's not necessarily the case with Catalyst. And that's where I kind of mentioned the thing where the community stepped up somewhat in terms of creating more good examples of how to get to that point. So it was me as an iOS developer really figuring out how to create a good Mac app and how to create Mac controls and make it look like an Mac app and not just an iOS app on the Mac. So the question was, what did I do with the default menu items that you get with a Mac app? Yeah, really was trying to look around and see what similar apps were doing, what similar media streaming apps were doing. Obviously, mine's like not necessarily media streaming like let's say Netflix is, but figuring out what made sense for media playback, trying to copy that, figuring out what actually mapped to any of the controls I had. So if like things didn't work, like I don't do a lot of text entry, just go ahead and remove all that type of stuff. It's a lot of trial and error and just like, I guess, comparing to what else is out there. All right. I don't think there's any more questions in the room. If there's anything on Slack, I'll check afterwards. And if you all have anything you come up with later, feel free to hit me up on Slack or here. I'd be more than happy to chat about it. So thanks.